Good afternoon, and welcome to the first TCIPG webinar for the fall 2013 term. And today we will have a presentation from Robin Berthier, who is one of the TCIPG researchers. He has been with TCIPG for a few years. A couple of years before that, he was in Maryland. And he's actually in a time of transition. Many of you have heard of NetAPT, which is one of the products of TCIPG research that's received fairly high profile and is now the core technology of a startup company. And Robin is going to be president of that company. Great things. And we're all hopeful for success for Robin and for the company, of course. Robin is, in addition to being a really smart researcher, has always been interested in his research transitioning into the real world, again going back to his days at Maryland and the research that he does here, very much in the TCIPG idea of having research that's scientifically important but also impactful. Robin's also a bit of a Renaissance guy. I happen to know that he makes films, and he's a good piano player too. Anyway, without further introduction, Robin.
Thank you very much. Thanks. All right, so I have two objectives with this presentation. The first one is to talk about tech transfer, how tech transfer works at the university. And I think that will be relevant in particular for current students, because when I was a student, tech transfer was kind of blurry to me. And so hopefully this process explained here will be clearer. And then the second objective is to introduce NetAPT for those who are not aware of the tool, and also to give the latest developments and what's coming up next for the technology. Let me start with an overview of what tech transfer represents in the academic world in the United States. This is a report from the Association of University Technology Managers. They do a survey every year, and as you can see in 2012, and the percentages below are the increase or decrease compared to the previous year. But the whole total universities in the US received more than 23,000 disclosures, either invention or software disclosures, 14,000 new patent application filed, among which more than 5,000 were issued. Also 5,000 licenses executed between universities and companies, and a total of more than 700 new startups formed. It's important also to notice that there's about 4,000 startups currently active that were grown from the academic world. Those licenses executed between universities and startups in 2012 generated an income of more than $2.6 billion. So it's a large industry. All right, just a bit of background on myself. So my research interests have spanned from intrusion detection to network analysis, incident response, and critical infrastructure security. For each of those domains, I had several projects, among which few of those were involved in tech transfer. That started, as Al mentioned, when I was a grad student at the University of Maryland. My thesis project was on the topic of honeypots. For those not familiar with honeypot, those are machines which are unused and left plugged on the internet only for the sole purpose of collecting information about attackers and attack processes. And there's always this tension between having a scalable honeypot framework and some that can represent a computer with a high interaction. And so I worked on with a team to develop this Honeybreed software to have a hybrid honeypot framework. During the course of the project, we decided to open source it. So that was the tech transfer path chosen for this one. And now the project is still active. I'm no longer developing it, but I know that other academic groups are using it and publishing papers. Second project that I've done at the University of Maryland was a NetFlow-based visualization and processing framework called NFSite. And this one I'm still developing it, and as well it's an open source project available on SourceForge. At the University of Illinois, I'm working on two main projects. One is called Analyzer. This is a specification-based intrusion detection systems for smart meters. This one is not yet in the tech transfer pipeline, but I think there is some potential for going into that later, but we don't know exactly what we'll be doing over there. And then the second one is NetAPT, which is the focus of this presentation today. I'll try to illustrate the way the tech transfer works and through that software and what we've gone through and what's coming up next. So NetAPT was started in 2006 as a PhD thesis project by Sync. And then it got funded through I3P, the Institute for Information Infrastructure Protection, for 2 years. And then it became a TCIPG project where the technology could grow. And so that was funded locally by ISEC, the Illinois Center for a Smarter Electric Grid, as well as TCIPG for some part of the technology. Now the project is funded by DHS, and the goal of the current grant is really commercialization. And I have some slides later to give you some more information about that, the unique aspect of that DHS grant and what we can do with it today. The current team includes Jenny Appelquist, myself, Muna Bemba, Faisal Hassan, Rakesh Kumar, Professor David Nicol, Edmund Rogers, and Professor Bill Sanders. And Muna, Edmund, and Professor Nicol and Professor Sanders were the core team at the very beginning of the project. In particular, Edmund was working at Emron at the time, and he was actually the first user of NetAPT, helping the team to develop some key feature that was useful for him in his day-to-day job. Then he transitioned to the university 2 years ago. So the motivation for NetAPT is really to focus on critical infrastructure protection. As you may know, process control networks are becoming increasingly connected to other networks in the enterprise system. And those connections need to be restricted by what we call firewalls. So the firewalls implement access control lists and try to prevent access to key part of the network. The challenge is often in an organization you have 10, 20, or 30 firewalls, and it's really complex and difficult to get the configuration for those firewalls correct. And it's easy to have subtle errors that could lead to security vulnerabilities. In addition, there is some regulation which are mandated for power utilities, at least the large one. Those are called North American Electric Reliability Corporation SIP regulation. SIP stands for Critical Infrastructure Protection. And large utilities have to go through audits where auditors will check some specific network configuration and make sure that everything is compliant and that the critical assets in the organization are well identified, and also the connectivity to them are correctly set. When violations are found, fines are being issued, and that's a real example, a public document that took online last year where a utility got fined $750,000 because of a violation found after an NERC-SIP audit. So utilities are looking for tools and solutions to try to better prepare for audits and, of course, to avoid getting fined. So there's a strong need for automated solutions to help compliance officers working at utilities as well as auditors to better understand the network and the effects of access control. So when there are a set of rules in firewall, they want to understand what the impact of those rules is and what are the flow which are allowed or prohibited by those rules. So NetAPT address that need by being able to import firewall configuration, read them, understand them, and then infer the network topology from firewall configuration, as well as automatically analyzing the end-to-end connectivity from any host, any IP in the network. The key feature are to provide you a mean to visually explore your network, as well as to significantly reduce the resources needed for complying with those regulations that I mentioned. And at the end, because an engine is doing the checking part, you reduce the risk of having human errors when you do the checking. So you improve the accuracy of the security analysis. So before continuing with the slides, let me show you how the tool works so that you can get a clear idea of what it looks like. So when you open the tool, you have this GUI, which is separated in two parts. On the left, you can see the firewall configuration that you imported and dive and explore the firewall rule sets. And then on the right, you will have your network topology, visual way of looking at your network. So let me open some configuration that I analyzed before. So once again, you have your firewall configs on the left. So in this case, we have 6 firewalls, and I can open the rule set for any of those firewalls and then understand exactly what those rules are doing or how they've been written in the configuration. And then on the right, I have my network, and those 6 firewalls are being represented by those firewall icon over there. And so one can manipulate the topology to make sure they understand how the different domains are being represented, and you can color code the node or rename the node according to your needs. Once you're familiar with your topology, the goal of NetAPT is to allow you to explore all the possible paths in your network. So you can query the engine to return all the flows which are possible from any of those IPs that belong to your network. And then you can send queries to the tools such as who can access that specific asset, or who can go from this corner of the network to this other network. When you do that, you have a listing of all the potential flows. So in that network, there's 1,200 of them. And you can filter those, of course, to just go with the most interesting ones. And one can click on any of those and highlight directly on the map what that connectivity does. So it really saves time for both auditors as well as network operators to understand visually how the flows are possible in the network. So they can just select a given rule or a given flow and then see visually where that flow goes. You can also do the opposite, where I click on an IP, I click on a host and ask the tool to show me all the incoming traffic. In that case, I have 2 possible flows to that host. So maybe I want to review those and make sure that those 2 are legitimate. And if there's one which is not conformant to my policy, I can review my rules and either change them or review my policy. All right, let me go back to the slides. Okay, so now that I gave an overview of NetAPT and you have an idea of how the tool works, let me explain this tech transfer pipeline that I mentioned at the beginning. So it goes in a circle starting from the top left corner. The very first step is to submit a disclosure to the Office of Technology Management, OTM. And so most universities have an office in charge of receiving disclosure and supporting faculties and researchers in transferring technologies. It's a simple form that you download and you fill to put information about your invention or your software. So you mentioned the creators, the funding, you describe what your software or your invention can do, and then you describe your intention with that project. This first step kickstart a very well-documented and systematic process followed by OTM to give you feedback and advice on how to best leverage that technology. So it starts on the left. When they receive a disclosure, they will review. There's a screening process, at the end of which they will give you feedback and advice on how to move forward with your technology if you're interested in tech transfer. That can be to give you the recommendation to file for a patent, or to explore some commercial option or non-commercial option. In the non-commercial option, you can open source your project, or you can transfer to another academic group or another academic center. But if you decide to go with the commercial licensing, what will happen is that there will be an assessment of the market possible for that product, and then you will enter into some negotiation phase, and I'll give some more detail on that phase later in the presentation. And then when you agree on some licensing terms, the university will follow you to make sure you meet your milestone and that the company is growing according to the plans. So for NetAPT, we submitted the disclosure in 2006, and then we filed for a patent for the core technology of the tool in 2008. And the patent was issued in June of 2012 last year. So one thing to notice here is the time it takes to have an actual patent issued. In that case, that was 4 years, but that's something to take into account when you are thinking about patenting some technologies. This is the first page of the patent, which is related to how the engine works to analyze a distributed set of firewall rule sets. And a few months after receiving that patent, we got the grant from the Department of Homeland Security, the one I mentioned earlier in the presentation. And that started a year ago. And it's a grant which is a bit unique because it focuses on helping academics to commercialize their product. So it comes from the Cybersecurity Division of the Science and Technology Directorate, which is directed by Doug Munn. And that division and that directorate are part of the Homeland Security Advanced Research Project Agency, HSRPA. And they state that one of their objectives is to develop and transition new technologies, tools, and techniques to protect and secure system networks, infrastructure, and users. So NetAPT fits right in that definition. I mean that the goal of the tool is to go according to that objective. So we submitted a proposal, got the funding, and when I say it's unique, it's because it's a short-term grant. It's just 1 year, and it's really focusing on helping you to commercialize and to give you the resources to make like the best product you can from the research project. So if I summarize the key benefits we had over the past year from this grant, maybe one of the first and most important outcome is we were able to expand our evaluation program to put the tool in the hand of more users. And following that, we of course received a lot more feedback and reports on bugs and potential issues to help us develop the tool in the right direction. We were also able to allocate resources to better meet the need of users in terms of development. So we strengthened the development team. And we also allocated resources to develop professional documentation and training material to explain how the tool works and how users can best leverage the different features of the tool. So when I said growing the user base, over the course of 1 year, we had the evaluation license signed by more than 20 new organizations, and mostly power utilities, but also some auditors as well as security consultants. We were able to participate in audits and see how the tool can be used to help utilities becoming compliant with those regulations. One example was back in March where we followed the utility, and we had the tool being enhanced based on their specific configuration. So we worked hand in hand with the utility before the audit to make sure that the tool would be ready and that we could help them, and the tool was successfully used to prepare for the audit. We also organized and held our first user tutorial in Dallas last May. I was following the SPP SIP workshop, Southwest Power Pool SIP workshop. And we had 17 attendees who could download the tool, try it, and we had a 2-hour hands-on tutorial where we could show the different features and explain how to use the tool for preparing for audits. So I mentioned feedback received from users, and exposing the tool to more users increase, of course, the volume of feedback. And so what I'd like to do now is to go through some key lessons we learned through that process and illustrate through a few technical slides to show you how the development roadmap is transitioning from what I would call a research-centric roadmap to a more user-centric, and to transition from an academic product to more like a commercial product. So the first one was that users encountered difficulties to install and set up the tool. And so what we saw was that the tool depends on different development languages and programming languages, and also depend on external libraries. And the more dependencies you have, of course, the more you increase the risk of having errors during installation. And that's a natural state for any project that has been developed over many years by different programmers. But then at some point, you meet that tension where you need to decide if you want to fix what's existing and mostly working, or you want to refactor and not start from scratch, but really change the way the tool works and try to simplify the thing. So we took that decision, and now we're in the middle of refactoring some key module of the engine and the GUI to simplify the code base, to remove those dependencies, and to try to simplify also the debugging and the real-world reporting, so that the tool can be easier to install and working most of the time. One key aspect also in the development environment is to enable what's called rapid prototyping, where you want to be very agile in the way you receive feedback from users, and then you can incorporate that feedback, fix bugs, test features, and go test the tool in a quick manner. Another lessons learned was that users expressed difficulties to understand the concept of a global policy, and that's a key issue which is important to get right for the tool to be useful. So before going to the technical slide, let me step back a bit and explain how the tool views the notion of policy. So we can think of the term of policy according to those three different layers. So at the top, at the high level, you have the regulation and best practices, which gives recommendation. An example in the case of a power utility network would be that remote access to critical assets shall be denied. Then you go down one layer and you have the access policy, which try to translate those recommendations in a set of rules. So in that case, following that example, we could say that all flows originating outside of the control network towards IP addresses of critical assets should be denied. And then at the lower layer, you have the actual implementation by firewall. And in that example, I put some Cisco rules which would deny access to few IPs to try to implement that policy rule. The thing is, it's important to understand that you have a gap between those three layers. And the goal of a tool is to try to bridge those gaps. And the way NetAPT does that is to have the GUI assisting you to make to bridge the gap between those regulation and best practices towards defining a policy. And then the engine takes over to check that your definition, the specification of the policy is correctly implemented by the set of firewall rules. So what we discovered by interacting with users is that operators wanted mostly to use the tool to understand the effect of access control and to understand what was the possible flow in the network. So we kind of redefine our notion of policy to match with the slide I mentioned before, but to really like focus on the reporting aspect. So now the direction for the tool is to help you specify what flows you think are conforming with the policy, and have the GUI helping you do that, and then have the engine reporting any flows which will be outside of those specifications. In addition, we also introduced the concept of domain to try to restrict the analysis to some key part of the network. Instead of previously having a full analysis for the complete network, now operators can just specify part of the network and get analysis for those subsets. In terms of architecture, if I give you like a different perspective, so I gave you some more like the theoretical view of what a policy is, but in terms of the internal programmatic NetAPT architecture, this is how it looks like, where you import, the tool imports firewall configuration, translate them to two types of file, a topology file which will capture the network topology, and then a rule set file which would capture all the access control lists from your different firewalls. And then you use the GUI to define the policy, the box on the left, and then the engine can take over and do an analysis to make sure that what you specify as policy match what's in your network. And then if there's violation, if you have reports of flows which are not compliant with your specification, you get a report on which you can review and act on. So internally, the tool still uses some formalisms to capture that policy, but users don't have to interact with that formalism. They don't have to write those complicated rules that you see on the right-hand side that the tool is using. Instead, they can use directly the GUI to click on some host and specify source and destination networks, and then get reports based on their selection. And the policy is automatically derived from those selections. All right. A third challenge and lessons learned by exporting the tool to more users were that we had requests to support more firewall from different vendors and from different types of firewalls. And so we discovered that firewall vendors implement their access control lists in a different way. And so a key challenge for us now is to be able to write an engine that can work on all the firewalls, but still keeping some of the specific aspect and concept of those firewalls to make sure we don't lose any accuracy. So in theory, a firewall is a quite simple device. It's just a collection of group definition for network or host or protocols, and then access control list. So you see a table that will give you source IPs of networks or host, destination, and then an action, either deny or accept. And the goal of firewall is to go through that list of ACL in order, starting at the top, and then when you have a match, you take the action which was specified by your access control list. In practice, each firewall vendor has a different configuration format to capture those access control lists. So at the top, you see an example from Cisco iOS where you have two rules, one denying access from a specific network, and then the second one allowing access to everything else. And then you have the equivalent for Juniper on the left, and then for Fortinet on the right. And so the challenge here is to write parsers for each of those configuration formats to capture them in a single unified format, but while still keeping some specificities of those firewall vendors. So at the core, NetAPT is still using an XML-based unified schema to represent those access control lists, and so far it supports Cisco, Juniper, Checkpoint, SonicWall, and Fortinet. But we are in the middle of implementing the right set of modules to be able to support the key and specific feature of those firewalls. And that can become quite complex when you have network address translation, routing, concepts such as virtual private network or chaining of ACLs or virtual addresses. So that's an example of the schema that the tool is using to capture this unified firewall format. And the challenge doesn't stop at the configuration parsing. It continues on the way a firewall processes a packet, and that goes deeper in the engine, where the engine needs to take into account how packets traverses firewall and need to model accurately how those are working for different vendors. So on those two pictures, you see how a Juniper device will treat a given incoming packet. So it will go through several modules, like a first screening module, then a route lookup module, and then a policy and some NAT module. And then you see the pipeline for a Fortinet device. And of course, there's differences and different modules in different orders. So we need to capture that and the engine to understand that to accurately represent how exactly the network is being traversed and what are the possible flows in the network. Another lesson learned from having the tool used by more people was to have the need to include routing devices. So previously, when the project started, the vision was to focus exclusively on firewall configuration. And from those configurations, we have description of interfaces, description of networks, some routing statement, and then description of VPNs or other key concept of firewalls. And the role of the tool and the topology inference algorithm of the tool was to build knowledge of the topology from those firewall configuration. And that meant mostly to merge network that could be defined differently in different configurations. So in that example, on the bottom picture, you could have the same network being represented in two different firewall configurations, and the goal of the inference algorithm is to recognize that those two are the same object. But then we discovered that layer 3 devices such as routers would also have description of access control list as well as extensive, of course, routing statement. And doing an analysis of network connectivity without having the full knowledge of the routing statement prevents you from doing a fine-grained understanding of exactly how the packet can go from one corner of the network to the other. So now we see the need of adding router devices and being able to parse and understand configuration from routers and even switches to make sure that we can have a complete and exhaustive picture of how the network works. All right, and the final lesson that I wanted to mention today is on improving the workflow and the reporting features. So the current features in terms of helping you to understand how the network works and to report that is the path highlighting map that I showed during the demo, where you can select a link and see on the map how it's being highlighted. And then you can also export your connectivity results to Excel and exchange that with other colleagues or review the results and work on them inside Excel. The feedback we got from users was that this was a good start, but they wanted additional features to be able to filter those results, as well as to be able to better understand how to prepare for an audit. So they mentioned the need for a step-by-step set of tasks defined in the tool to prepare for an audit, a visual way to represent what is being called in the industry as the electronic security perimeter, which is the set of access control isolating critical assets, and then to better highlight the risk associated with some given connectivity path. So when I showed that when I gave the demo of the tool, and you see this full listing of possible flows and possible paths, When you have like 1,000 of them, you want to be able to prioritize them and to look more into the most risky ones. And so we're working on features to try to do that. So improving the GUI, improving the filtering features. And another major thing that we do is to introduce what we call defense in-depth metrics, where based on the result of a connectivity analysis on a given network, a user can query for any host in a network the risk associated with having that host being compromised. And we introduced like two concepts. One is the concept of depth, which will be the minimum number of stepping stone required for accessing a given host. And then the concept of width, which will be the number of possible ways you can reach a given host if you try to attack it. So that's not yet implemented, so this is just a screenshot that we modified manually, but we are working on modifying the GUI to have this implemented. But to give you an overview of how that works, you could select a network, like the yellow network on the right, and then you know that this network is the tool knows that this network is accessible by those two hosts, and so it will give you like a color coding to show the risk associated with that network. So you can understand how many steps an attacker could do to reach that host, and you could also understand how tight your configuration is in terms of protecting against potential compromise. All right, so back to this tech transfer pipeline. The next step after the previous phases that I mentioned was to negotiate and execute the license between the university and the newly formed company to support the tool to become a commercial product. So we just signed the license a month ago with the Office of Technology Management, and defining and negotiating a license with the university often involve to define the scope of the license, what the license should cover and what it should not cover, and then to define a royalty model as well as sub-licensing model based on the result from the market assessment. We also have a patent reimbursement discussion, as well as defining performance milestones for how the commercial venture will take the product and commercialize it over the next few years. All right, and then final step is to incorporate the company. So we just finished that phase as well. The startup called Network Perception has been incorporated this summer. And we are working in collaboration with the research park at the university. They have a center called Enterprise Work, which is supporting startups to grow from academia. So they provide grants to cover for the initial cost of legal and accounting. And they assign an entrepreneur mentor that you meet with every month, and they can give you advice on how to start the company. They also give you resources for logo and website design. So we leverage those resources to design our logo. And they give you a workshop and assistance to help you find funding, such as the small business funding opportunities, SBIRs. So next short-term step for network perception is we got accepted in what's called the NSF Innovation Core program, which is also a unique program where you get an intense 3-day workshop. You go to one of the NSF center as a team of 3 people, and you present your commercial product or your academic project, and then they will teach you how to best interact with users and how to best define your business model and the feature of your product. And so it's intense because they teach you to really contact many potential customers in a very short period of time, and so you need to get out of the building and interact with them with like a big volume of them in a short period of time. So we'll do that in January, early next year. And we also are busy to transfer the code from the university to the company and to prepare for the very first commercial version of NetAPT. And we've taken the decision to rename the tool to have the NetAPT being on the university side and have a tool of a different name on the commercial side. And so the tool will be called NPView, and we're hopeful to have the release ready for the fall semester. All right, so in conclusions, the tech transfer process from academia is a well-defined and supported process. I didn't have a clear idea before going through that, but I learned a lot, and there's a lot of knobs and parameters to turn, but at the end, you have a very well-documented and systematic process to follow. One big lesson learned was that the key to design a viable product is to interact with users as much as possible. Because you learn quickly that the commercial product will be different from the research project, and the more you interact with users, the more you have the right direction to take for commercialization. And final lesson is the key to evaluate solution and to improve your approach is to have this rapid prototyping environment where you can quickly incorporate feedback from users, fix bugs, and test new features. And so, of course, the more collaboration with industry, the earlier on you have collaboration with industry, the better to develop that development framework and succeed in doing that. So if you're more interested in learning on the technology behind the tool, I've put the list of publications that have been done on NetAPT as well as the patent. And if you're interested in learning more on the commercial aspect of the tool, so feel free to contact me at that email address or that phone number. I will also have a website, network-perception.com. And that concludes the talk.
Ready for questions?
Yes.
Oh, Carl, you're first.
Oh, okay. Great presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Carl Reinhardt, University of Illinois. Yeah, I've got two questions. First question is, you cited an example at the beginning of the potential costs in which some networking protocol violations occurred. But am I wrong in thinking those NERC auditors have a lot less information than you have at your fingertips? Because this is an innovative product. So it's just by luck that they find those?
I'm not sure. You mean that they don't have the full knowledge to go after checking the compliance?
Yeah, they have no, the networks are extremely complex, and they have no
Right.
way of checking all of the links.
Right. So they have a systematic process to go through audits, and most of the time they ask utilities to prepare documentation all year long so that you have the documentation ready when the auditors come to review your configuration and to review the process in place to be compliant. So it's true that there is, because the audits are just scheduled for a few days, you cannot go over everything, so you will have to sample. So I don't know if there is chance involved in that, but you cannot cover everything. And having tools to better give you reports will increase your coverage and the probability of getting the right results and the right compliance.
And I've used NetAPT, so I really like it. I think it's really cool.
Thank you.
It seems to me that what you do is you gain a tremendous amount of knowledge to bulletproof yourself.
Right.
The second question is, I don't think I heard anything about information assurance requirements or processes. Can you describe what you've done to give users confidence that your product is not going to compromise their systems?
Sure. So that's a good question. The tool works completely offline. So you could have the tool installed on a virtual machine and just open the virtual machine, have the tool, you securely bring your firewall configuration, you do your analysis, and then you can close everything, and the tool does never do like any connection towards the external world. Actually, at the beginning, when the project was started, one feature was to connect. The tool was automatically connecting to firewalls, downloading through SSH the configuration, so that you didn't have to manually import your configuration. But that was seen as a potential risk because the tool was doing a connection outside of its own machine. So we shut down that feature, and now the user is in charge of securely bringing the configuration on an encrypted drive or something, and then the tool works completely offline.
Tom Overby from Illinois. Nice presentation, Robin.
Thank you.
So now you've got a company incorporated, you got a logo, and I like your logo.
Thanks.
Okay. And you have a tool that was developed through a variety of different sources. Can you talk about your funding model going forward? Are you guys venture capital funded, or did you put in your own money to fund it? Are you selling this tool? Is it a rent the tool? And then, so that's the first question: is what's your funding model going forward now that you got an office? And I assume you're going to be paying some people. And then the second question is, can you talk a little bit about how you're dealing with the fact that you've got people in the company that are with the university, so you got conflict of interest and conflict of commitment constraints? So those two questions.
Excellent questions. So for the first one, the funding model, I think, depends on the maturity of the tool. And so because NetAPT is quite mature and ready for sales, at least we believe it is, we decided to go with the self-funding model. So the shareholders buy their shares, and then we bootstrap the company from that initial seed capital. So we're hopeful that we can do some sales with our first commercial version that will be ready in a few months, and then hire people and grow from there without the need of venture capitalists. But in case that plan doesn't work, of course, the backup plan is to go with VCs. And then your second question was on conflict of interest. So yes, again, the Office of Technology Management has a very well documented process to define and review what's called a conflict of management plan. So we work with them to define that document, and everyone signed the document. And so now we have some process in place to make sure that everything on the university side is isolated from the company side, and when we transfer code, and that's well defined to not have any conflict possible. Yes, Prosper.
Yeah, Prosper Panompabi, University of Illinois. First of all, I would like to extend my congratulations, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you.
For such accomplishment. I have some questions to ask you. The first one is transferring technology from academia to industry, or going from doctorate, PhD, lab, to industry in university research park. What can do someone who don't have a PhD degree to succeed in your current position? That is my first question. Yeah. My second one is, I am pretty sure that while in academia, you have been working with a number of companies, maybe the 20 utility, your relationship did start while in academia. Some of them learned that they have somewhere a PC which was not, nobody knows of. And they get the fix. My question is, did those companies, while in academia, pay to you any dollar figure money? If not, what was the barrier? If yes, what happened to the legal status of the university as a non-profit organization?
Right.
And my last question is, now that you are moving to the industry, what kind of a relation do you forecast maintain with the university? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So let me try to make sure I remember those three questions. So the first one was related to not having a PhD and transitioning to on the startup. So I don't think actually having a PhD degree helps or limit your chances of succeeding in doing the startups. I mean, I know many examples of non-PhD people who successfully went to startups. And if you go at the enterprise work building, you can directly meet with entrepreneurs and from different backgrounds and different degrees and different departments, and they all can tell you their story. But I don't think the PhD degree is mandatory for succeeding. The second question on the cost or the cost model of the evaluation program. So that evaluation program on the university side was a completely free evaluation program. So we had an evaluation license that the organization were signing to get the tool, and in exchange of having to use the tool, the license defined some requirements in terms of providing feedback. So the organization agreed to test, evaluate the tool, and then to provide us with feedback on the tool. But there was no financial transaction involved. And then the last question, I think I forgot the last question.
What will be your relationship with
Oh, yes. So that's still to be defined. I don't have a precise plan, but my goal now is to transition progressively from the university to the company. So I've been not making myself involved in new projects on the university side, so that I can end my current project on the university, and then I'll do some kind of part-time work at the university and then full-time for the company. So that will be progressively based on how the company evolves. But then I want to keep having a relationship and keep collaborating with researchers at the university, of course.
All right, so I'm told that there are no questions online.
Okay.
So last chance. All right, let's thank the speaker and wish him the best.